Well, good afternoon. It's George Yates here with Justice for All. And as Greg Hall, my producer, says, Justice for Y'all. And it's 2 o'clock, so we must be on the air at 16:50 a.m. And welcome to the show. We got a great show coming up today. Let's see, we got a lot of stuff in the news we're going to talk about in our second hour. Topic overload, I think, with everything that's happened with what's going on in the world. But our first hour, we're going to be talking about addiction and those people that are with people that are addicted and those that are addicted. And our guest is Candace Plattor, and she wrote a book called Loving an Addict, Loving Yourself. And she's a registered clinical counselor in Vancouver, British Columbia. And she's with us today. How you doing, Candace?
I'm great. Thank you.
Well, listen, I see your book here. Tell us about your book. Is it available online? Can people buy this book? What is it? Tell us a little bit about your book.
Yes, I think probably the best way is to go onto my website, and you can get the links for how to buy the book. But it's on Amazon. It's on Barnes & Noble and Chapters online. It's in some bookstores. If you would like it in your bookstore, please call your local bookstore and ask for it. And you can also get the PDF version of it on my website, which will get to you immediately.
Well, it's called Loving an Addict, Loving Yourself, the top 10 survival tips for loving someone with an addiction. I think what's the outside of your book? I think that the what the go-to before your book, I think, is what, Codependent No More. I think you've heard of that one, right?
Yes, I've definitely heard of Codependent No More. I've read it. I myself am a recovering codependent, so I understand how loved ones feel, especially at this time of year. Yes, my book is a little bit different from other books about addiction or even family addiction, because most of them are, if not all, are directed toward helping an addict to get treatment or how to get them into rehab or how to get an intervention going with an addict. So the focus is still really on the addict. In my book, it's a little counterintuitive for some people, because my book focuses on the loved ones and their lives. So sorry.
So, well, isn't the loved one? That is the Al-Anon person, right? That's the codependent person, or no? Yes,
the loved one is generally a codependent person. Yeah.
Now,
I have a really simple definition of codependency. It's kind of a buzzword in the addiction field, and really what it means is that if you put other people's needs ahead of your own on a fairly consistent basis, then you're probably codependent.
And so how was it that you got into writing this book? Tell me a little bit about you and what makes you tick and how you ended up writing a book about addiction and also about those who are involved with people with addictions.
Okay. You might have to forgive me, you and your audience, because I have a little bit of a throat thing going on today, but I might have to clear my throat a couple of times. My story starts in 1973 when I was diagnosed with Crohn's disease. If anybody doesn't know what that is, it's a very painful and debilitating inflammatory bowel disease. And I'm a lot better now, but there's no cause that they know of. There's no cure that they know of. So people just kind of live with this. And the reason I'm better is because I take really good care of myself. But when I was diagnosed back in the 70s, the doctors really didn't know what to do for me. It was a pretty new disease for them. So what they did was they gave me a lot of medications, and several of them were very addictive. So I was on Valium and codeine and Demerol, which would be equivalent probably to today's OxyContin, for about 15 years, daily. All three of those drugs. And I also rediscovered pot, which I had smoked socially in university. It was never a problem then. But when I started using it again for the Crohn's, it worked for me, and I can totally understand medical marijuana, but marijuana is addictive. There's no question about that. So So for a lot of years, I was using very addictive substances, and like anybody's body, my body became addicted. And so at the end of that, the bottom that I reached was I was so depressed and so sick that I really felt suicidal. I thought I might take my own life, and it really scared me. So what I did was I reached out for help at that point and got some really good help. I met some people who were going to 12-step programs, Narcotics Anonymous, Alcoholics Anonymous. I started going to those, and that was the beginning of my recovery from addiction, because I was quite addicted.
And you describe this in your book as you're now sober 20 years?
Well, I'm actually clean and sober 27 years now. Yeah.
And so you wrote this book within the last 6 months? This book just was published, right?
No, actually, this book was published in 2010.
Oh, okay.
And we've just released a revised version of the book, which has a couple of extra chapters. It has a chapter about my story as well as some other things. So, no, it's been around about 5 years. It's won several awards, and it's being used in treatment centers across North America, Canada, and the U.S., and even in Australia.
Well, I see that you won the International Book Award winner. So tell me a little bit now, Candace. You've got the book as the top 10 survival tips for loving someone with an addiction. My guess is that there's a number of people that are listening to this show right now that are either addicts or are involved with addicts or know addicts, because it's prevalent in all of our society today. So what are the top 10 survival tips? Why don't you run through them briefly? What are the top 10 tips, or work through the most important ones, and let's just go through them one by one so we can educate people on what they need to do if they're involved with an addict.
That sounds great. And, you've really, you've really made a good point that many addicts are also loved ones. Many loved ones are also addicts. So, they're wearing two hats. If they're addicted to something and they were raised in a family with addiction, that makes that, if anybody like that is listening, that makes you addicted as well as a loved one of addicts. So this book will be very good for you as well. And I, too, am an addict and a loved one. So I wear two hats with that.
So were you involved then for years then with an addict then? And so you not only have a personal story of addiction, but also a personal story of loving an addict, and that gives you this perspective?
Absolutely. And I've also had many years as an addictions therapist working with both addicts and their loved ones. So I come from it from different angles and know it very well.
Well, if you've just joined us on the show, I'm George Yates, and this is Justice for All. And, every week I interview guests that are experts in various fields that are of interest to me. So, because I'm trying to learn some things about this myself, and as I learn things, I'm hoping that your average person out there listening will be interested as well. So, tell me, what's the number one top survival tip for somebody that's involved with an addict? What does someone do to break this cycle or to somehow improve their life?
Well, I will tell you that the survival tips are not necessarily in order of importance. They're all really important. There are a few that I think are more important than the others. But the survival tip number one, as I put it in my book, is come face to face with reality. If you're not facing your reality, if you're minimizing it, if you're trying to pretend that it's not really there, that you really don't have an addict in your life, that things are really okay, then they're just going to keep going on the way they are now, or they'll get worse. Because addiction is a progressive condition, and it gets worse. It progresses. So we need to come face to face with reality. We need to say, yes, this is bad, and this is bad enough for me to reach out for some help.
Well, doesn't the person that, so what do you just move out? I mean, you break off the relationship and say it's over?
No, not necessarily. Not necessarily, but boundaries, healthy boundaries do need to be set. And so loved ones need to find somebody who can help them. This book can help, but help them understand what their boundaries are, why they haven't been setting them, how they can set them, how to language them, and then how to maintain them in the face of conflict. You see, most loved ones, as codependent people, are also people pleasers. And I kind of use those terms synonymously, codependent and people pleasers. People pleasers, and I'm a recovering people pleaser, we don't like conflict. And we will do just about anything to avoid conflict. That's why we allow people, such as addicts, to get away with behaviors that we shouldn't be allowing them to get away with. But we are trying to protect ourselves from conflict.
Well,
so it's really meeting our needs as the loved ones. It's not meeting the addict's need. That's not what the addict needs.
Well, how do you reconcile? I mean, it seems easy for the person that, as let's say, okay, they're living with an addict, they've had enough, and so they just break off the relationship. That seems to be the easiest way to do it. You say, well, I've set this boundary, and the boundary is I'm not going to tolerate it anymore. But so that would be, it seems to me, the easiest way to face reality. But your book also, I guess, takes the approach that sometimes this person can set boundaries and still maintain the relationship with the person. How can you do that when you'll say you set a boundary and the person just doesn't comply, and now you're back into this control thing again, and you're right back to square one, aren't you?
Well, if you set a boundary, I mean, that's a really good question. If you set a boundary and the person doesn't comply, then you can look at leaving. But, with the loved ones, they so deeply love the addicts in their lives, and they're so fearful about what's happening to them. They don't want to just kick somebody out, most of them. They don't want to just kick somebody out. They want to try to make it better. One of the things loved ones don't understand is that we cannot change anybody else. We can't make an addict change.
But doesn't the addict take advantage of this person this way? And
that's right.
And so because the people pleaser, let's say, the codependent person in the relationship doesn't want the relationship to end, the addict will continue to manipulate the situation, will continue to promise to do better, but never does. I mean, isn't that this
right.
continuing cycle that people in Al-Anon go through?
Yes.
And until that's what happens, right? And so what?
Well, not always. That's not always the way it goes.
Right.
I mean, when I work with the loved ones, I teach them how to set appropriate, healthy boundaries that are self-respecting for themselves.
But that's assuming that these people care enough about their relationship to come see you. I mean, I appreciate that what you're talking about is you're actually sitting down with couples, I suppose, working through. Now, that's somebody that's motivated to do better. But what about the person that's got, the addict is saying, I don't have a problem. They're not going to the 12 steps. They're not doing any of it. The other person is trying to get help for themselves through, let's say, self-help like your book or Codependent No More. How do they set boundaries like this when the other person just refuses to admit they have a problem?
Well, the most effective boundary that I have come across is to say to the addict, look, we love you. We love you so much. And we understand now that we've been enabling you, that we haven't really been helping you by not having boundaries. So what we're going to tell you now is that we will no longer support you if you choose to stay in active addiction. If you want to come out of active addiction and go into some kind of active recovery, let us know when you're really ready. Don't waste our time. But when you're really ready, we will help you. But we are not going to support you if you're going to continue to stay in active addiction. Because to me, active addiction is a choice. And if it's okay, I'd like to explain what I mean by that.
Okay, well, I'm getting it now. So you're basically the person that wants to end this sort of cycle puts an ultimatum out there. It says, look, I'll stay with you, but you have to go into recovery. If the person refuses to go into recovery, then the codependent person has a choice to make. They can either continue to stay in it and enable, or they can just say, I'm out of here.
Exactly. And at the same time that the addict, they're asking, as loved ones, we're asking our addicts to go into a recovery program, to learn about ourselves, to stop the addictive behavior that we've been using. That's really scary for an addict. That's a really scary thing to do. At the same time that we're asking them to be uncomfortable and do that, we need to allow ourselves to be uncomfortable. We've got an addiction to the addict's addiction.
Right.
We've got an addiction to the addict. So we need to change what we're doing and get help for ourselves as well at the same time.
What about relapse? What if this person goes and says, okay, I'm going to do it, and starts going through the program, and then, a week later or a month later has a relapse, a bad incident, let's say, a drinking incident, something that might involve the law or whatever, something that's dangerous or over the boundary. We'll say you've set a boundary. You're saying, I'm not going to tolerate this anymore. And so then what does the codependent person, or what does the lover of the addict do then? Does they say, that's it, now I'm out of here? Or do they give them second and third chances, or what's the game plan from that point on?
And again, that's a really good question, and it depends on the personal situation. Everybody's situation is different, even though there are many similarities involved in this. Everybody's situation is different. But what I suggest is that if an addict relapses after treatment or during treatment, you give the same boundary to them again. But you say to them, now that you're back in active addiction, you are no longer living here. We don't even want to see you until you're ready to go back into recovery. We've been there with you, and we don't want to continue doing this because, George, if nothing changes, nothing changes.
Right. That's one of your mottos in your book. If nothing changes, nothing changes. So you have to make a change. You can't just go on the way you did, because the likelihood of the addict getting any better is probably zero if you don't change the rules.
Yes. I believe that addiction actually can stop, but that the enabling has to stop along with it, sometimes before the addiction stops.
Right.
We're going to continue to enable an addict. Why should they change anything? In fact, I had a client who said to me, I thought this was great. She said, why would an addict ever wake up if we're going to continue pressing the snooze alarm?
Well, so the first tip is face reality and set boundaries. What else have we got on your top 10 list?
Let me take a look.
This isn't Letterman, but...
Survival tip number 2 is discover how to love an addicted person and stay healthy. So again, loved ones of addicts are, as I said before, I consider them to be addicted to the addict's addiction. That's their addiction. Their addiction is enabling. Their addiction is trying to control something they can't control. It's exhausting. It's frustrating. It's disappointing. They get so angry, the loved ones do. And once they understand that they aren't in control of what an addict is going to do, only the addict makes his or her own choices, then they can start to look at their own lives. They can step away from this. They can come off the roller coaster of the chaos that the addict, if an addict is in active addiction, they're always on a roller coaster of chaos. And the loved ones need to step away from that and start looking after their own lives, because in their addiction, what they've done is they've put their own lives on the back burner. They don't know who they are. They need to be in some recovery too.
Right. You know, what do you think about these recovery programs? I know there's AA and there's NA, and that's for the addict, and there's Al-Anon and there's Al-Teen and those types of a group therapy for both the addict and the addict, family and relationships and so on. How do you, when you counsel people, either the addict or the family of the addict, do you recommend that they also participate in those programs, the Al-Anon programs and the AA and NA programs?
Well, I recommend that they try them. The 12-step programs don't work for everyone. When I was in my earliest recovery 27 years ago, that's all there was at that time. But there are other programs now that also help people very much, other support groups, self-help groups. So, yes, I do suggest that people go to a 12-step program and see whether they like it, whether they feel comfortable there, because the 12-step programs have wonderful things in them like sponsorship and, the fellowship of just being with people who understand you because you've walked into the room.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I do suggest that, but if it's not okay for them, for whatever reason, to look for something else. 12-step meeting, support groups, those are not therapy. Therapy is a different thing. Therapy is about really getting underneath the issue, because addiction is only a symptom of what's underneath it. A lot of people don't know that. They think that if they just put down the alcohol and drugs, or if they just stop spending so much money or eating as much or not eat, if they just stop doing the behavior, then everything will be okay. But we have to find out why we've been sabotaging our lives, why we've been shooting ourselves in the foot and not respecting ourselves, in order to continue to be healthy, in order to not use these behaviors.
Great.
That's the work I do with addicts and with loved ones, is I help them. I especially help people who are loved ones understand what stops them from really setting boundaries. What are they so afraid of? How can I help them language the boundaries and support them in this so that they feel more comfortable doing it?
You're listening.
Because they need
go ahead.
to do it.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I said they need to set these boundaries. They need to do it.
You're listening to Justice for All. This is a weekly show. I'm George Yates, and we're here with Candace Plattor, who's a counselor from Vancouver, British Columbia, who's just written a book called has written a book, Loving an Addict, Loving Yourself. We're going to take a short break here, and when we come back, I'd like to talk with Candace about what she's just said, that, first of all, you have to make this decision to stop the addictive behavior, whether that's alcohol or drugs or whatever it happens to be. And then you have to, at some point, explore the underlying problem for that addiction, whether it's mental illness or some other sort of psychological issues or whatever that has come up in your life. And so when we come back, I'd like to talk with you about the underlying issues that cause people to use alcohol and drugs and so on. So we'll be right back. This is George Yates with Justice for All.
The place people look to for their holiday light needs is Inter-Ray Outdoor Lights. Let the professionals at Inter-Ray decorate the exterior of your home and business without you lifting a hand. Get $100 off a $1,000 purchase. Call 355-5276 and log on to interray.com. Light up your home or business this holiday season with Inter-Ray. Call 355-5276 today.
Hi, this is Greg Picaveras. Join me for Sports Scene each Wednesday from noon to 1 right here on News Talk 1650 WHKT. You can also hear the show on TuneIn as well. We will talk to local, regional, and nationally acclaimed sports guests, and we'll interact with our audience as well at Greg Pick on Twitter. Sports Scene, Wednesdays from noon to 1 right here on 1650 AM.
We talk about it all the time on the show. Are you safe and secure online? Are you private? Leo Laporte here, the tech guy. Well, I've always said if you're on the internet, you're in public, but there are things you can do to protect yourself a little bit. You certainly should know what the risks are. We talk about that each and every week, plus all the latest news, gossip, and tech support. It's coming up this weekend right here with me, Leo Laporte, the tech guy.
Saturdays 8 p.m., Sundays 6 p.m. on K-Talk 1650.
Hello, this is Big Bear inviting you to visit myself and Grandma Bear at Little Bear's Consignment Boutique, where you'll find the best new and gently used children's brand name clothing and equipment. Clothing from newborn to teens, dresses, suits, shoes, strollers, bassinets, toys, and anything else you need. Little Bear's is your stop. We even carry maternity clothes. Check us out on Facebook or stop in 200 North Battlefield Boulevard in the Harbor Watch Shops of Chesapeake near the locks. Little Bear's Consignment Boutique, where you're always greeted with a smile.
Okay, so we're back with Justice for All. I'm George Yates, and we're here with Candace Plattor. The reason I asked this question about the underlying problems, you made a comment earlier that that AA and Al-Anon and stuff are not group therapy, but I have a lot of friends in the addiction community. I'm a criminal defense lawyer as well, so if it weren't for addicts and people that abuse alcohol and drugs and so on, they get in so much trouble. I'm a criminal defense lawyer by trade. And I think if it weren't for addiction, I would be out of a job because so many people get into themselves in trouble with it. And I find myself in a professional capacity just on a daily basis with addicts and going up in front of judges and trying to say, this time I'm going to do better. This time I'm going to get clean after they've done their third and fourth offense DUI and whatever. But I know a lot of people in the community as well, and Al-Anon and AA have worked well for a lot of people. Isn't AA a bit of group therapy for people? And aren't they really trying to, after they've made that decision to stop drinking, let's say, or stop doing their drugs or actually a combination, aren't they then going to that program and kind of a group therapy session with their let's say other addicts, and kind of working out their underlying mental problems that caused them to get addicted in the first place? Isn't there something of that going on in these 12-step meetings?
Well, there is something like that going on, definitely. What happens in 12-step groups is generally people are sharing about, the way they put it is what happened, what it was like, what it's like now. I think I got that confused. What happened, I think, is the first piece. What was that like? What is it like now for you? So they're sharing their experience, their strength, their hope. They're sharing their story of addiction, and they're sharing their story of recovery. But not all groups are created equal, and sometimes people talk a lot about they just talk about what it's like to drink or what it's like to use drugs, and we call those drugalogues or drunkalogues, where people just talk about that and they're not going any deeper inside of themselves. Sometimes they talk for a long time in groups like that. So it's not always, it's not always a situation where people are saying, well, I use drugs because I really didn't feel good about myself. Most of the time, those kinds of comments aren't heard in 12-step meetings.
Because you're just not they just don't go deep enough, probably, is what you're saying. And
I think they don't go deep enough. And this is where, not everybody wants to do that in front of other people. There's a lot of shame involved in addiction still, unfortunately. Right. So they don't want to talk that openly about what happened to them. But this is why they're... And for that
reason, I think that AA is not for everybody, right? Can people get free of addictions without going to a 12-step program? Is that possible?
Oh, yeah, it's possible. I think that the one of the best things about 12-step programs is the fellowship, is getting to know other like-minded people who also want to be in recovery, because a lot of addicts and alcoholics have been using in isolation. I was certainly one of those people. Nobody knew what I was doing. And a lot of, some people are partiers and they're out there and they're doing that. But a lot of people are closing the curtains and turning off the phone and using by themselves. And they're very lonely and depressed. So to walk into a room where there are people who really understand you, like I said, just because you go there, just because you walk in, is a wonderful feeling for a lot of people. But it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to want to get down and dirty and deep about what happened to them and why.
Well, so what is the underlying, would you say that, and I know there's a couple of questions that I have, so I'll kind of lay them out there, First of all, this week there was an interesting article in the paper I read about how we all have this sort of there was actually some discovery that human beings have been able to metabolize alcohol, and we've got some sort of a bacteria in our stomach that's been allowing us to metabolize alcohol for, let's say, 10,000 or a million years, however many years it's been. But it's an evolutionary thing, and that it's a possibility that some people that are unable to drink, let's say, or become alcoholic don't have this ability. So it's a late blooming evolutionary thing, and some people just don't have the ability to metabolize alcohol. So that's one issue I think that's interesting, that physiologically some people just don't have the genetic makeup in order to drink alcohol. And the second comment about alcoholism or drug abuse is to what extent, in your experience, and maybe this is my first question, to what extent do you think people are self-medicating for an underlying mental illness that, let's say some other kind of psychological problem, and they've been self-medicating? Do you see that a lot?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that is what's going on with any kind of addiction, either with mental illness or with emotional problems. And, not everybody who's an addict to any kind of behavior has mental illness per se. A lot of people do, and depression is considered to be a mental illness. But most people who use an addictive behavior across the board are doing that because they don't feel good about themselves. They don't feel good about their lives. We live in a very addictive society that, basically the bottom line is about money, and every commercial that you see on television or even that you hear on radio or that you see especially in a lot of these magazines is all about the fact that there's something wrong with you and you better do something different and better do something better. Never let them see you sweat.
You made a comment early on, and then you said that the person that is trying to get clean has to make the decision to stop using. Simple as that. They have to, and you're saying they can do it. I mean, they have to it's just a decision that a person makes, right? They just say, I'm going to stop. I'm going to make that decision. I'm not going to drink anymore. I'm not going to use these drugs anymore. Simple as that. Is that an easy decision to make? How does someone go about doing that?
Yeah, it's simple, but it's not easy necessarily. And, if I could do it, anybody can do it. I was heavily addicted to a lot of things, and if I could do it, anybody could do it. But I had to reach a bottom first, and that's usually what happens to people, is that they get to a place where they really don't like the life that they're living anymore. And some of them, like myself, become suicidal, thinking, I'm not sure I can go on like this. Most people who are suicidal, by the way, don't want to die. They just don't want to live the way they've been living, and they don't know any other way. But I do want to explain that I don't think that anybody chooses to become an addict. I know I didn't. I don't think we think to ourselves, gee, let's go and take Addiction 101 and let's be addicts this time around. That just sounds like fun.
But you are saying that they can choose to not be one.
Well, they can choose to not use the addictive behavior. I still consider myself to be a recovering addict after 27 years. That's just me. Now, maybe not everybody wants to think that way, but I do, because I might be able to have a glass of wine at dinner, and I might be able to smoke a joint at a party and not have it upset me or not have the next one grab my life and have it be out of control. But I'm not sure.
Right.
I'm not sure if I can do that safely.
But your book is still based upon, it says, loving an addict, loving yourself. And if you've just joined us, I'm George Yates, and this is Justice for All. And every week I interview an expert in a particular field of something that's of interest to me and my producer, who likes to listen in and learn some things himself. We're learning a lot from Candace Plattor today, who's written this book. And we've been focusing a lot on the addict lately in this show here, and how the addict gets clean and makes this decision and go on. But your book says loving an addict, loving yourself. So let's get back a little bit, Candace, for the last few minutes of our show here today, as to what the person that's in with the addict does. I mean, how do they survive this situation. We've talked about some of your top 10 tips as to what this person is supposed to do. But if they've just had enough of this, what do they do? Or how do they, what do you recommend to somebody that has just had enough, and how do they get out of this? How do they love themselves, and how do they end up helping the addict reach that bottom so the addict will get better? How do they do it?
That's exactly what they do. Your job as a loved one, for all of you who are listening, is to make the addict as uncomfortable as possible staying in active addiction. And then when that addict is uncomfortable, then you can help them move into active recovery. But your job is to make it uncomfortable. Enabling an addict is never a loving act. And this is what's counterintuitive about what I write about, because most loved ones feel like, he's broke and he's hungry and I've got to give him money and he doesn't have any place to stay, so I have to let him stay here. Even if he's abusive with me, I have to let him stay here because where will he go? And we get those kinds of situations happening. But what really has to happen for the addict is that he needs to be broke. I'm saying he, but she as well. He needs to be broke. He needs to be hungry. He needs to maybe not have any place to go. He needs to see how difficult it is to be in a life of active addiction when mommy and daddy aren't helping or enabling, when that kind of thing isn't going on.
Well, that's fascinating. So doesn't that create a bit of animosity? Does the addict then, I guess the addict then has a choice to make, huh?
Yeah, sometimes there is animosity. Sometimes I have animosity from the loved ones, the clients that I have from their addicts. They want to come see me and set me straight, But yes, the loved ones have to understand that this is a choice that their addict is making. It's absolutely a choice to stay in active addiction. They can come out of active addiction. Anybody can, and millions of people recover every year. So the loved one's job is to start setting clear, healthy boundaries. Sometimes addicts, and I say this with all respect to the addicts because I'm one too, sometimes we act like 5-year-olds. And sometimes people have to treat us that way in the name of love. Because we love addicts, not because we don't.
So at some point when mom and dad say, son, I don't ever want you to come to our house again. We don't want you to call us. We don't want you to write us. We don't want an email. We don't want a text. Son, we don't ever want you to ever come back to our house again. Goodbye.
I would never counsel anybody to do that.
Well,
never counsel anybody.
But isn't that having that addict hit bottom? If addict keeps coming back to mom and dad's house and stealing their credit cards so that he can go get drugs, or showing up at the house saying mom and dad don't have any place to stay, and finally, isn't that at some point the family has to say, we don't want you here anymore, right? I mean, how else do they help that person if what you're saying is true, that you've got to help them to hit bottom? How can you do it any other way other than to say, I'm cutting off all contact with you? You have to go. Isn't that what you're saying for people to do?
No. Okay. It sounds like that's what I'm saying for people to do.
Because I've heard that story from some of my friends who are in recovery, that's exactly what happened. That's exactly what was their bottom. So, right. I've heard that as a success story from people whose parents finally said, we've had enough of the lying, the manipulation, the stealing, the false promises, the everything else. There's another reason for my addiction. At some point, whether it's the husband or the wife, the children, the parents, they have to at some point say, we're done, right?
Well, when people reach that point, if they really do reach that point where they say, we're done and we don't ever want to see you again, then they've reached that point. But when they come see me, I do things with them before they reach that point. And so, again, what I was saying before was that the best boundary is to say, I love you so much that I'm not willing to hurt you anymore. I'm not willing to enable you anymore, and I'm not willing to support you if you're going to stay in active addiction.
Well, how does a person do that, though? It seems to me, and I read your book, and I enjoyed it, and I got a lot out of it. But I kept asking this question: how does one stay in the relationship, okay, with an addict without there being enabling? It's almost, it seems to me, an impossible situation, because if that addict is continuing to use or continuing to, let's say, if the boundaries are no more use, no more alcoholism, no more drugs, so on, no more lying, no more manipulation, and so on, which are just part and parcel of every addict that you ever come across. Now, the person that's living with them is going to, by absolute necessity, be enabling that person if they're even in the relationship. One way or the other, that person is going to pass out at the wrong time, and you're going to have to... how in the world do they ever get over this enabling unless they cut all ties? That was my biggest question in the book. And maybe it's possible, and maybe it's because some of your people that come to you have maybe made that decision without hitting bottom, but it seems to me there's no way to hit bottom unless you've cut them off, right? And I'm confused really by that.
Right. I hear your confusion. I don't think we need to cut ties completely, even if a person is continuing to use and be in active addiction, but it's up to the loved one. It's up to how they see it and how long they've been in that situation and where they are on that continuum. But, one of the things that I suggest to people who don't want to cut all ties with somebody who's still choosing to stay in active addiction is to say to them, okay, well, why don't you have lunch with them once every 2 weeks? You go and you buy them lunch, and you check in with them. But you don't have them living in your house, and you don't have them texting you 50 times a day saying, I need money, I need money, I need money.
Okay, I see. So you don't cut off all contact, but you cut off any kind of supportive in terms of financial and that sort of thing.
You don't give an addict money. Don't give an addict money.
Right. Well, now,
you know what it's used on.
Now, how does the person that's been going through this roller coaster with this addict, how do they get help for themselves? What do you recommend in terms of your counseling?
Well, I recommend that, Al-Anon is a really good program, so I recommend that kind of program. There are others for families as well. And I recommend that they go to, that maybe reach out and do some research about different kinds of treatment options for them, not just for their addicts, but for them. There are many treatment centers now in North America, Canada, and the U.S. that have family programs for people with addicted loved ones, even if their loved ones are not part of that treatment center. So even if they're not clients yet of a treatment center, the loved ones can still participate in week-long treatment programs for themselves around codependency and people-pleasing, boundary setting, that kind of thing. They can also call clinics that deal with, and therapists like myself that deal with addiction, and ask them if they work with loved ones.
Now, I'm with Candace Plattor. I'm George Yates. This is Justice for All. Our book's Loving an Addict, Loving Yourself. How did you, we've talked a little bit about your addiction. Tell me about your experience as a codependent.
Oh, well, I grew up in a family with addiction, and as a result of that, I became involved with many people romantically who were addicts themselves, who were addicted themselves to one thing or another. So, I just thought if I could just fix them, I couldn't fix my parents, and I guess I thought if I could just fix these people, and if I could get them to love me more than they love their addiction.
Tell us about your parents. What were your parents addicted to?
My parents were addicted to pills. They were addicted to alcohol at some points. My father was a gambler. Lots of different kinds of addictions.
So you grew up with this as a whole lifetime of, as a child growing up with this your entire lifetime?
Yep. Yep, basically. I mean, my parents were academics. They were both teachers, and, you never know what's going on behind closed doors. There are a lot of people who are functional, who have really good jobs and, pillars of society who have addiction. So it happens in all kinds of families.
Right. And so you had these functioning addicts as parents, and then as you grew older, then you seemed to gravitate then to partners that were addicts themselves?
That's right, because when people are addicted, when they're in active addiction, they're very self-absorbed. So my brother and I grew up with two very self-absorbed parents who didn't really care that much about us. And what I did was I found that very comfortable. When I met a man who didn't really care about me all that much, who was self-absorbed into his own addiction, that felt comfortable to me. It wasn't healthy, but it was comfortable. It was my comfort zone. And I wanted to control him and fix him and make him better because that would make me feel better.
Now, your brother, did your brother become a codependent as well, or how did he survive that childhood?
I don't want to speak for him, but I think in some ways he did, yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So, but your addiction became, and yours is a little different from, and I've experienced many clients that had the same problem that you had. They had an illness, they had a problem where they actually started using. You had the Crohn's disease.
Right.
I've had some other people that might start on painkillers because they had a car crash or something like that, and they start taking, Vicodin or something like that, and then get addicted to it, or Adderall or whatever. So you had an addiction that actually had its genesis in an illness, as opposed to some sort of a psychological. Is that right? You didn't.
I'm
you
not
didn't
sure.
become.
I think both things were happening. I think one of the reasons I had developed Crohn's was because life was so difficult for me. I think my body just kind of imploded on itself stress-wise. But I think I became an addict because the drugs made me feel a little better about myself somehow. And I was also in a lot of pain. So I think both things were happening.
Some of the addicts that I've known, when I'm around them, I will say, for instance, you have someone that's not doesn't drink, and you might not even have a drink, or maybe not have as many drinks as you might otherwise. If someone's around that you might feel a little uncomfortable, although most people that are in recovery will say, "Oh, no, go ahead, it's okay." I got a friend of mine that'll say, my dad always told me never trust anybody that doesn't drink. A friend of mine that's been in recovery for a long time. So he doesn't make you feel guilty at all about having a drink or something in front of him if you're out at dinner or something like that, which I think is refreshing and very cool, because you can't get away from alcohol in our society. You just can't. It's everywhere, as you mentioned earlier, on the TV and, the beer commercial and everything else. So how does an addict that's in recovery deal with the fact that it's just everywhere? They're going to go to a party. There's going to be people around. How do they deal with that? And you personally, do you still feel like, gee, I'd love to have that drink, but I shouldn't? Or do you, how do you respond to those kinds of that comment?
Well, for me, I don't really want to drink or use. I sometimes think about it. I mean, I think that the most natural thing for an addict or an alcoholic to want to do is drink or use. I think that's the most natural thing, but we don't have to do it. And every once in a while, I wish I could, but I know I can't. And so facing the reality and appreciating the life that I've developed for myself is very different from what I had before. So I choose to stay clean and sober because it's much easier for me, and also because I see addicted people all the time, and it's not great out there, so why would I want to do it to myself again? But you're absolutely right about the parties and the alcohol, especially at this time of year. And this is where being part of 12-step programs or something like it is really helpful, because you need to have people around that understand where you are, that you're in early recovery, you might have a problem with this, you need to be able to contact them. If you're at a party, you could go in another room and call someone and say, I'm feeling tempted, and just let somebody know. You might also want to not go to those parties.
Yeah, and that's the great strength.
If you're in really early recovery, you might want to not go.
Right.
For me, I don't like being with people who are drunk and high because they change and become really silly and sometimes kind of stupid.
Well, I think, I agree. And, fortunately, I do think that times have changed. And I think that years ago it was harder for somebody to go to a party or whatever. And now I think that there's much more respect for that. If somebody comes to a party now and says, it doesn't agree with me, or I'm on the wagon right now, I don't drink. I think that there's a lot more. I think that they have done a good job of that on television lately with some of these designated driver things. For all someone's got to say is, I'm the designated driver tonight, and I think that's gotten a lot more respect. So we've only got just.
Nobody has to say to somebody at a party, "Oh, I'm an alcoholic and I don't drink."
Yeah,
you don't have to.
Yeah, because then there creates the stigma that, there's something wrong with me, I can't do it. We've only got a few seconds left in the show, Candace, and I want to say, first of all, I want to thank you for coming on the show. We've only got a minute or two. If there's something that you would like to say to, there's two people out there I'd like you to say some things to. One is the family member of the alcoholic, and the other is the addict, and the other is the addict himself. What do you say in one sentence to the addict about getting over their problem, and what do you say to the person that's with the addict? I know if we've covered it, great, but is there something you haven't had a chance to say that you'd like to say?
Well, I think I would say the same thing to both camps, all right, to the addict and the loved one, that this is a choice you're making. You can make a different choice. There is help out there for you. And, there's a saying in 12-step programs, don't leave 5 minutes before the miracle happens. Keep trying. Keep trying with yourself, with your addict. If you're an addict and you're relapsing, keep trying. Just keep reaching out to someone. Keep trying, because you can do it. You just have to keep trying. And if you're enabling an addict, this is not a loving act. Keep working on yourself to find out why you're doing this. I have a workbook that goes along with the book that you can use for that.
And tell us about your book again. While you just got a couple minutes left, Candace, tell us the name of your book again, and your new book I think that you've got out, and how people that are listening to this show here can get a copy of your book. We got 2 minutes.
The book is called Loving an Addict, Loving Yourself, the Top 10 Survival Tips for Loving Someone with an Addiction. The new book coming out is the same book. It's a revised edition. It has a little bit more in it. You can get it on my website, which is, will that be on your site, George? Or
yeah, we'll go ahead. Why don't you go ahead and tell us, and then we'll get it posted. Give it to me right now, and I'll put it on my site.
Okay, it's CandacePlattor.com. So you just have to make sure you're spelling it right. So it's CANDACE, P as in Peter, LATTOR.
Got it.
So it's CandacePlattor.com. And it's on the books page.
Got it.
So you can find out about it. You can read all about it.
Well, Candace Plattor, thank you for being on Justice for All today.
Thank you. I had a good time with you, George.
All right, thank you. And this is Justice for All with George Yates. We're going to come up on our next hour here, but we've had Candace Plattor the last hour, and you can go onto the website at ghylaw.com and listen to the interview in its entirety if you haven't had a chance to listen to it. And we're going to go to a CBS News break here, and we'll come back in the next hour with Justice for All with George Yates.